In this video, I'll be reviewing Oral History Association, Do History, and Positive Exposure. Let's start with the main features. Oral History Association has a top navigation bar that includes the home and about pages, the company blog that integrates and podcasts, pages for resources, publications, and partners, an annual meetings page for committees, task forces, and interest groups, and a page for regional and international organizations. Within the homepage, there is a link that leads to the member site and other calls to action to register as a member, donate, participate in meetings, and attend events. The secondary navigation bar lists pages for principles and best practices, grants and awards, and jobs and internships. There are also 2 working social media links for Twitter, accompanied by viewable tweets about upcoming events, and Facebook, as well as an archives button on the homepage. Tangible content on the homepage consists of information about meetings, award winners, workshops, institutional review board updates, protection for human research subjects, and oral history. Finally, statements regarding Black Lives Matter and the past pandemic, logos for the site and its partner, and an advertisement for the next annual meeting can all likewise be accessed from the homepage. Do History's navigation bar is on the bottom of its homepage and contains the following categories: Home, Your Interests, Who Was Martha, Martha's Diary, Film, Doing History, Archive, On Your Own, Sitemap, Tech Help, About, Search Bar, Project History, Credits and Founders, Use and Rights, Feedback, and Contact. Many of these links run circularly in the middle of the homepage. They presumably represent the steps and types of content the user should explore to piece together oral histories based on the life of healer and midwife Martha Ballard. There is also a drop-down menu that allows users to choose these activities. Although there are additional categories for genealogy, how to use primary sources, teaching with this site, and midwifery and herbal medicine. Positive Exposure prioritizes photography over other features, so the homepage is understandably image-oriented. Otherwise, there are links to the sponsors, social medias, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram, as well as the guest book, contact page, private policy, and cookies. The site's top navigation bar lists the pages containing information about their establishment, multi-purpose community center, shop, events, networking opportunities, and donation options. Now let's look at the attended audience. Given the size and scope of Oral History Association, it has a large visitor base made up of policymakers, educators, students, historians, librarians, activists, journalists, and filmmakers. Do History, by contrast, is solely targeted toward educators and students due to its function as a teaching tool and educational activity hub. Positive Exposure, like Oral History Association, is conducive to both the academic and public sphere, intended for students, educators, advocates or ambassadors, researchers, healthcare professionals, patients and their families, and charities. Now, what is the purpose of these sites? Oral History Association provides guidance and a platform for sharing insights on how to standardize the ethical collection, preservation, dissemination, and application of orally delivered stories. Specifically, it has a list of goals, guidelines, and evaluation standards for interviews, as well as awarding outstanding achievements in the field of oral history. Do History uses Martha Ballard as an example to show students how to interpret surviving materials about the realities of living as a woman in a newly pioneered region. Positive Exposure chronicles the life histories of people with genetic differences through photography, and to a lesser extent, articles. In collaboration with various healthcare, educational, and human rights institutions, it promotes awareness and opportunities for users to participate in the betterment of patients' lives. How about the quality of resources? Oral History Association presents its resources through mixed media. audio, visuals, and text that meticulously guide the user along actual cases, guidelines, and expert interpretations of both. These media allow users the flexibility to decide on the best practices that will be suitable for a specific project. Oral History Association collaborates with a plethora of diverse oral history practitioners to bring a collection of essays, case studies, and webinars, among other informative materials, to students so that they have a much clearer picture of the direction they could take with their project. I believe students can develop good habits in particular by extracting relevant content, such as long-term thinking in terms of how the project will be used and tailoring the interview to the subject and the specific topic in question. The website does not generalize its resources to the point where they mostly leave students to their own devices. Oral History Association frequently reports changes to IRB standards so that students are always aware of the expectations but also feel encouraged to participate in their modernization. Overall, the site has both a theoretical and practical element, although I would have liked to see interactive opportunities that students can practice their skills with to understand how they can adjust their methods for their project. The site relies somewhat heavily on several key authors, which can result in limited perspective and bias. But all the topics nevertheless focus on at least certain stages of the process in great detail, as well as striving for currency and representation. Do History also utilizes mixed media, interactive activities, visuals, and text, albeit to provide students the means to piece together a narrative illuminating an overlooked historical event. By engaging with the site, students can cultivate their skills in interpretation, analysis, and creation. However, I would have also preferred to see interactive opportunities that teach best practices because students will need to keep in mind, for instance, ethics in the field, dialogue with gatekeepers, and issues to bring up with their supervisors and the IRB. Depending on their field or community of interest, students would likely benefit from other examples that do not make them feel limited in what they can base their projects on. Positive exposure employs mixed media, audio, visuals, and text, to a degree. Their primary focus, however, seems to be on blog posts documenting interviews with patients. These posts offer insight into how the subjects themselves cope with their genetic differences, what their lives are really like, and how they influence policy. First-hand accounts assist in rendering stories believable and relatable, as well as perhaps shedding light on any misconceptions about an individual or a group of people. However, solely relying on them potentially results in bias and/or a limited knowledge base. To comprehensively educate readers on the biological and social implications surrounding genetic differences, prompt them to consider how they can create a more accommodative environment in their own lives, and encourage further research, I would recommend adding more professional resources to supplement the patient's stories. Now let's see the presentation and visuals. Oral History Association is consistent in its color scheme: blue, white, black, green, and red, and almost all its web pages share the same template, with only 2 of them taking the user to a different website. Thus, nearly all the information is posted on the same website and easy to access through either tables of contents, headings, or the keyword finder. Needless to say, I do not have to worry about looking elsewhere for the resources I need. The shades and generous use of white space are pleasing to the eye and do not make me anxious to find what I seek. Despite the voluminous texts, simple, large, and medium-sized fonts give them legibility. However, many of the pages do nonetheless suffer from content fatigue. The texts are crammed together, but what makes them difficult to navigate is their unnecessary repetitiveness. The home page is the most notorious example of this, leading the user to believe there is much more essential information for reading than there actually is. I am left feeling overwhelmed when I glance at the site as a whole, because I believe I would spend too much time consuming duplicating materials rather than narrowing down to the relevant ones. Do History is also guilty of repeating virtually all of its categories, from the clickable icons for interactive activities to the navigation bar. This, once again, confuses the user into thinking there is a variety of content warranting our attention. There is almost no consistency in color schemes or web page templates. Many of the pages make me feel as though I have gone to an entirely different website, detracting me from the purpose of the site. The site does not seem to take much advantage of its space, but when it does, it overcompensates with chunky paragraphs that only make use of the site's length, mismatched colors, and clashing fonts, all of which discourage further reading because the user is unable to visualize the narrative in a significant, engaging, and coherent manner. Frankly, the aesthetic alone is taxing to browse. Opportunities to organize the text, for example, via infographics, tables, charticles, and/or photo essays were overlooked. Additionally, there is not enough bevel applied for the user to tell which icons are clickable, particularly on the home page. As many of the icons overlap with one another, users may not realize that there are extra ones with their own functions. The site's user interface design does not at all reflect current standards. I would not be surprised to learn that the site has not been maintained or updated since its inception. Positive exposure, as I would expect, leans heavily toward visual appeal, although larger files do cause extended loading times on some pages. This can raise concern as to whether certain content is viewable or accessible and can cause the visitor to search elsewhere. With the exception of the home page, the rest of the site is consistent in color scheme and template. It takes advantage of headings to break up the content, but while it does not suffer from text-heavy pages to the same degree as the other two websites, it could nevertheless benefit from organizing large bodies of text with tables of contents. The bars in the forefront on the home page move whenever I scroll up or down, and this is rather distracting. White space is otherwise implemented generously, and the fonts, while somewhat unsophisticated, are easy to read. Now let's take a look at the usefulness of information. Despite the potentially disorienting nature of oral history association, it has the most useful information of the three sites for both novice researchers and seasoned professionals. It may be easy for the untrained eye to get lost. Students might not be sure where to start, but the resources, all of which are accessible and keep abreast with advancements in the field, are categorically organized according to their specific purpose that reflects the site's branding. They are clearly labeled based on target audience, medium, subject, and relevance. Do History is intended as a skill testing apparatus. While I do not wish to assume student needs, I think there are nevertheless only so many times a student would need to refer back to it before realizing they at least feel comfortable enough to apply their learning to their practice at an intermediate level. Because there are no other challenges available and the site is not updated, students would presumably move on. Educators supervising beginners would likely find the site more helpful as they can use it with every new class they teach. That is, assuming they only focus on the activities. Do History promotes plenty of resources, but aside from them being largely defunct or obsolete, it does not clarify their purpose, explain why students might need them depending on their skill level, or suggest other interactive sites for acquiring new abilities. Unlike Oral History Association, there is no sense of organization, maintenance, or context in which the sources could prove useful. Positive exposure encourages a connection between users and patients with genetic differences through first-hand accounts, so the former could have an incentive to participate meaningfully in the lives of an underrepresented community, rather than regarding them as a statistic of a distant situation. However, there must be more evidence as to how other industries are responding to it, and whether there has been substantial progress in research so that the initiative demonstrates credibility and is not, for example, an attempt to exploit vulnerable communities for profit. How current are the sites? Oral History Association is updated at least once every month with new blog posts. Nearly, anyway. And all of their resources are from as recent as the 2010s, so visitors have access to the latest developments in academia and policy. Many of the interactive features and files on Do History are not compatible with current browsers. The site relies too heavily on outside sources rather than proving itself productive and reliable with its own prepared content. The source links tend to either be broken or outdated. Otherwise, the majority of listed sites that do work have not been maintained for at least a year. Positive Exposure seems to follow suit with Oral History Association in its maintenance practices, although it had to cancel its major events due to the past pandemic. So it remains to be seen how the site administrators will modify their content strategy to keep the audience of the organization invested in its initiative. Now let's look at the best features. Oral History Association excels in providing guidelines for best practices. These can potentially help students improve their skills in areas such as transcribing, indexing, summarizing, and cataloging. The language it uses is accessible to students, and the documents are easily navigable for details that may be helpful for them to keep in mind when submitting their own work or doing research, including subject headings, participant background information, dates, interview summaries, locations, and timeframes. Do History's strength lies in its interactivity and should ultimately be regarded as a model students may refer to when testing their interpretive and analytical skills. Positive Exposure has quality photographs and blog posts. Each photo tells a story, and each story is given a visual through which visitors can develop a sense of familiarity with the subject. What are some improvements I would suggest? While it seems convenient at first, Oral History Association is nonetheless overly ambitious in its attempts to be the kernel of academic and non-academic resources. The volume of information, especially when it is repeated, and calls to action can either detract users from their reasons for using the site or confuse them during navigation. I believe that awards, jobs, and other categories that do not directly relate to education on best practices should be transferred to a sister site. Additionally, the site administrators should remove extra links that land on the same pages, as well as the one unidentifiable social media icon that does not work. Their UI design should strive to be as streamlined and up-to-date as possible, so as not to leave the impression that they do not exercise quality maintenance. The latter applies particularly to Do History, which would have to undergo drastic reconstruction to become a viable website by modern standards. A larger issue with it, however, is that there is little incentive to revisit it after completing all the activities once, given that most of its external sources have either been discontinued or are 2 decades old and beyond. Besides updating links for further reading, research, and practice, the site should be expanded to feature multiple examples focusing on other essential skills for oral historians, such as interview preparation and ethical research. This is so that the student is encouraged to return to the site and select an area to concentrate on when they wish to track their progress, depending on their requirements for their next project. Aside from fixing the aforementioned technical issues, Positive Exposure should upload articles dedicated to all the identified genetic differences, detailing what they are, how they develop, the degree to which they affect an individual's life, and possible treatments, among other topics. Uninitiated visitors, especially those who are susceptible to misinformation, must be able to rely on verifiable studies that demonstrate the weight of the issue, but also the potential for normalization. How would I use the sites? I could see myself using Oral History Association to learn about best practices, updates to the IRB, how to get involved in policy change, and to connect with experts who may be able to give me insight into various interpretations of said best practices. There is potential to address questions surrounding research ethics, that is to say, informed consent, comfort, and the rights of marginalized communities. Other issues the website touches on involve the degree of anonymity, beneficiaries of the research, confidentiality, and the expansion of field and research methods. Students could personally benefit from conversations about the inclusion of qualitative researchers in policy and the legitimization of action research. Do History makes for a decent quiz on analyzing, developing, and interpreting the substantiality and appropriateness of oral history sources. It could help me develop good habits and memory should I need to apply the skills to my own practice. Positive exposure is a way for me to understand how to interview a subject and frame their story in a way that is representative and respectful of them, but also for wider accessibility in light of policy change for a lesser-known cause. This is one of those cases where the research could benefit more parties aside from my sponsors and myself. Here are my overall rankings and preferences. Number 1. Oral History Association, unsurprisingly, places first, as it has virtually everything that could shape me into an ethical researcher and active participant in both the validation of qualitative study and the protection of vulnerable communities. Number 2. Positive exposure encourages me to consider topics or communities that are often underrepresented and or misrepresented in research. So I imagine I would visit this site every so often for examples of subjects who not only share vital information on the human experience, but also demonstrate their contributions to the field. And finally, number 3. Do History is an unregulated practice test that deserves a reboot to compete with other oral history resources.